Men ought either to be well treated or crushed, because they can avenge themselves of lighter injuries. Of more serious ones they cannot. Therefore, the injury that is to be done to a man ought to be of such a kind that one does not stand in fear of revenge. Niccolò Machiavelli. There's a particular kind of power that most people never recognize when they encounter it. It's the power that operates in silence, that strikes without announcing itself, that punishes without ever raising its voice. You've experienced it, I'm sure. That colleague who somehow always manages to make you look incompetent without ever saying a critical word. That friend who subtly isolates you from the group while maintaining a smile. That rival who destroys your reputation so carefully that by the time you realize what's happening, it's already too late to defend yourself. We live in a world obsessed with direct confrontation. We're told to speak our truth, to have difficult conversations, to address conflicts head-on. And yet, if you look closely at how power actually operates in the real world, you'll notice something curious. The most effective punishments rarely announce themselves. The most devastating consequences are delivered by people who never seem angry, never raise their voice, and never engage in open conflict. This is the art that Machiavelli understood better than perhaps anyone in history. Not the cartoon villain version of Machiavelli that popular culture has given us, but the actual political philosopher who observed how power really works when stripped of its moral pretensions. He saw that confrontation is often the weapon of the weak, while silence and indirection are the tools of those who truly understand influence. The question we're exploring today isn't whether you should punish without confrontation. The reality is that this dynamic already exists all around you. People are already doing this to you, whether you recognize it or not. The question is whether you'll understand how it works so you can recognize it when it's being used against you, and yes, perhaps employ it yourself when necessary. Because make no mistake, there are situations where direct confrontation isn't just ineffective, it's actively harmful to your interests. Let's start by understanding why confrontation often fails so spectacularly. When you confront someone directly, you're doing something that seems noble on the surface, but is tactically naive. You're warning them. You're giving them time to prepare their defenses, to craft their narrative, and to rally their allies. You're also forcing them into a corner, and cornered animals fight back with everything they have. Even worse, you're creating a spectacle, and spectacles are unpredictable. The court of public opinion doesn't always side with the person who's technically right. It often sides with whoever seems more sympathetic in the moment. Think about the last time you witnessed a confrontation at work. Perhaps someone called out a colleague in a meeting for taking credit for their idea. What happened? Did justice prevail? Or did the confronter end up looking petty, aggressive, or difficult to work with? Did the person being confronted skillfully deflect, making themselves look like the victim of an unfair attack? Direct confrontation has another fatal flaw. It requires you to be present, to be visible, to make yourself the obvious agent of punishment. This means you absorb all the social cost, all the reputational risk, and all the potential for backlash. You become the villain in someone else's story, and that's a role that's very difficult to escape once you've been cast in it. Machiavelli observed this dynamic playing out in the Renaissance courts of Italy, where a single misstep could mean exile or death. The princes who survived weren't the ones who confronted every slight with open warfare. They were the ones who understood that power flows through invisible channels, that punishment can be delivered through 1,000 tiny cuts that never reveal the hand holding the blade. So what does punishment without confrontation actually look like? It begins with understanding that power is fundamentally about perception and access. You don't need to openly attack someone to diminish their influence. You simply need to alter the conditions in which they operate, to shift the ground beneath their feet in ways that seem natural, almost inevitable. Consider the strategy of strategic silence. When someone wrongs you or behaves badly, the instinct is to call them out, to make sure everyone knows what they did. But there's often far more power in saying nothing at all. Silence creates uncertainty. It denies them the confrontation they might be prepared for. It leaves them wondering what you're thinking, what you might be planning, and whether you've even noticed or care. This silence can be devastating because it forces them to fill the void with their own anxieties. They'll start second-guessing themselves, wondering if you're planning something, if you've told others, and if their reputation is being damaged in conversations they're not part of. And the beauty is, you haven't done anything that could be pointed to as hostile or aggressive. But silence alone isn't enough. The real art is in the subtle restructuring of social and professional environments. Let's say someone has betrayed your trust or undermined you professionally. Direct confrontation would be satisfying in the moment, but likely counterproductive. Instead, you begin a campaign of strategic exclusion. You don't invite them to informal gatherings anymore. When decisions are being made, you consult with everyone except them. When opportunities arise, you somehow forget to mention them. You're not openly hostile, in fact. You remain perfectly cordial in all direct interactions. But slowly, systematically, they find themselves on the outside of important conversations, critical relationships, and career-advancing opportunities. The brilliance of this approach is its deniability. If confronted, you have a dozen innocent explanations. The meeting time changed, and you forgot to update them. Someone else was a better fit for that project. The social gathering was last minute, and you didn't want to bother them. Each individual action is defensible, unremarkable even. But the cumulative effect is devastating. This is what Machiavelli meant when he distinguished between injuries that can be avenged and those that cannot. When you punch someone directly, they know exactly who hit them and can strike back. But when you gradually erode their social capital and professional opportunities through 1,000 small, deniable actions, what can they do? Complain that you're not inviting them to things? That looks petty. Accuse you of deliberately excluding them? Without evidence of intent, it makes them look paranoid and difficult. There's another powerful technique, the strategic alliance. Instead of confronting your target directly, you simply ensure that the people who matter most to their success or reputation gradually develop concerns about them. You don't need to badmouth them explicitly. You ask careful questions, you express subtle doubts, you share concerns, framed as if you're trying to help. I've been worried about Marcus lately. He seems overwhelmed. Have you noticed? This plants a seed. Now, when Marcus makes any small mistake, it's interpreted through the lens of someone who's overwhelmed. You haven't accused him of incompetence. You've positioned yourself as the concerned colleague while fundamentally altering how others perceive his performance. Or consider this: I want to make sure we're all aligned on this project. I know Jennifer sometimes has a different communication style, so let's make sure we document everything clearly. What have you done? You've implied that Jennifer is potentially untrustworthy or difficult without saying either of those things directly. You've positioned yourself as the reasonable one trying to protect the team while subtly damaging her reputation. These techniques work because they operate beneath the level of obvious aggression. They reshape reality without seeming to do anything at all. But perhaps the most powerful form of punishment without confrontation is simply letting someone's own flaws destroy them while you carefully position yourself to benefit from their downfall. Machiavelli understood that the wise prince doesn't need to personally destroy his enemies if he can simply create conditions where they destroy themselves. If someone is arrogant, you don't need to humble them. You just need to ensure they're given enough rope to hang themselves in front of people who matter. If someone is impulsive, you don't confront their impulsiveness. You simply make sure their impulsive decisions have maximum visibility and consequence. This requires patience, which is perhaps why so few people employ these strategies effectively. The desire for immediate satisfaction through confrontation is strong. We want to see the look on someone's face when we tell them exactly what we think of them. We want the catharsis of expressing our anger directly. But that momentary satisfaction often comes at an enormous cost. You've revealed your hand. You've made yourself the visible agent of conflict. You've created a narrative where you might not be the hero. The Machiavellian approach is cooler, more calculated. You recognize that punishment is most effective when it seems to come from nowhere in particular, when it feels like natural consequences rather than personal vendetta. You become like the weather, an impersonal force that shapes outcomes, without being subject to moral judgment. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This all sounds manipulative, even cruel. Isn't this exactly the kind of toxic behavior we should be trying to eliminate from our workplaces and social circles? And here's where we need to be honest with ourselves about how the world actually works versus how we wish it worked. The reality is that power dynamics exist whether we acknowledge them or not. People are already playing these games and already using these strategies, whether they've read Machiavelli or simply discovered these techniques through trial and error. The person who refuses to understand these dynamics on moral grounds isn't taking the high road, they're simply making themselves vulnerable to those who have no such qualms. There's a difference between understanding power and abusing it. Knowing how to punish without confrontation doesn't mean you should do it casually or maliciously. But it does mean you should understand the mechanism, both for self-defense and for those rare situations where more direct approaches would be genuinely counterproductive. Consider a scenario. You're working under a manager who takes credit for your work and undermines you to higher-ups. Direct confrontation here is likely to backfire spectacularly. They have more organizational power than you do, and they've already demonstrated they're willing to lie. Confronting them just gives them an opportunity to paint you as difficult, insubordinate, or unable to be a team player. But what if instead you began documenting everything meticulously? What if you started copying senior leaders on emails, summarizing your contributions, framed innocently as keeping stakeholders informed? What if you cultivated relationships with your manager's peers and superiors, becoming known directly to them for your work? What if you subtly made sure that the quality of work that gets associated with your manager's name declines because you stop going above and beyond to make them look good? You haven't confronted anyone. You've simply changed your behavior in ways that any reasonable person might change when they realize they're not being properly credited. But the cumulative effect is that your manager's reputation slowly erodes while yours builds, all without a single confrontational conversation. This is the art of punishing without confrontation. It's not about being cruel for cruelty's sake. It's about recognizing that sometimes the direct path is the wrong path, that sometimes the most effective way to address wrongdoing is to create conditions where the consequences unfold naturally. There's also the strategy of strategic incompetence. If someone has been exploiting you, taking advantage of your goodwill or skills, direct confrontation might damage your reputation for being a team player. But what if you simply become mysteriously less competent at the things they were exploiting you for? Suddenly you're making mistakes, missing deadlines, and producing work that's just barely acceptable. You're not refusing outright, that would be confrontational. You're just somehow not as reliable as you used to be, specifically in ways that impact this particular person. When they complain, you're apologetic. You seem to be trying, but for some inexplicable reason, things just keep going wrong. They can't accuse you of sabotage without sounding paranoid, but they also can't continue to rely on you in the way they were. You've altered the power dynamic without having to have a difficult conversation about boundaries or fair treatment. Or consider the power of strategic honesty. This one is particularly elegant because it seems like the opposite of Machiavellian manipulation. Someone has wronged you, and instead of confronting them directly about it, you simply become scrupulously, even excessively, honest about everything else. You document meticulously. You over-communicate. You make sure there's a clear record of every interaction, every decision, and every agreement. This creates an environment where any dishonesty or manipulation on their part becomes starkly visible against the backdrop of your transparent dealings. You're not accusing them of anything. You're just being really committed to clear communication and making sure everyone's on the same page. But what you're actually doing is creating an evidentiary record that will make any future bad behavior on their part undeniable, while making yourself appear beyond reproach. The beauty of these approaches is that they work with the existing social and professional systems rather than against them. You're not trying to convince people that someone is bad. You're simply making their badness more visible or creating conditions where it has natural consequences. But there's a deeper principle at work here, one that Machiavelli understood intuitively. The person who appears to have clean hands while achieving their objectives is always in a more powerful position than the person who visibly gets their hands dirty. Think about political leaders who maintain popularity while implementing harsh policies. They don't personally announce the cuts or the layoffs. They create conditions where these things seem necessary, inevitable even. They let subordinates be the face of unpopular decisions while they remain above the fray, sympathetic but constrained by circumstances. This is why Machiavelli advised princes to have others carry out harsh necessities when possible. Not because the prince lacks the courage for confrontation, but because maintaining the appearance of benevolence while exercising power is the highest form of political art. You can apply this same principle in your own life. When punishment is necessary, the question isn't whether to act, but how to act in a way that preserves your reputation, maintains your relationships with others, and achieves the desired outcome without creating unnecessary enemies or drama. Let's talk about the strategy of natural consequences. This is perhaps the most sophisticated form of punishment without confrontation because it requires you to do almost nothing at all. Someone has wronged you or is behaving badly. Instead of confronting them or actively punishing them, you simply stop protecting them from the natural consequences of their behavior. Maybe you've been covering for a colleague's mistakes or incompetence. You stop, not dramatically, not with an announcement, but you simply stop going out of your way to make them look good. When they fail, you don't intervene. When others notice problems, you don't make excuses for them. You're not actively sabotaging them, you're just no longer actively saving them from themselves. This is particularly powerful because it's completely defensible. If anyone questions you, you have a perfect explanation. You're focusing on your own work, you assumed they could handle their responsibilities, and you didn't realize they needed help. But the effect is that suddenly, without the artificial support system you were providing, their true level of competence becomes visible to everyone. Or consider the power of strategic visibility. Someone has been undermining you in private conversations, spreading rumors, or otherwise damaging your reputation in contexts where you can't defend yourself. Direct confrontation is useless here because they'll just deny it, and you'll look paranoid. But what if instead you simply make sure that everything important happens in contexts where there are witnesses or records? You start having important conversations via email instead of in person. You bring colleagues into meetings where before it might have just been the two of you. You don't accuse them of anything, you just somehow arrange things so that their behavior becomes more visible to others. Gradually, people start noticing patterns. They see the discrepancy between how this person acts in public and what they say in private. You haven't said a word against them, but their own behavior has exposed them. There's also what we might call the strategy of elevated expectations. Someone has wronged you, and getting direct justice seems impossible. Instead of confronting them, you publicly praise them. You speak highly of their capabilities, their integrity, and their skills. This seems counterintuitive, but here's what it does. It raises the bar for their performance, while making you look generous and above any petty conflicts. Now, when they inevitably fail to live up to these elevated expectations, the disappointment is much greater. People who believed your praise feel personally let down. The gap between the image you've helped create and their actual behavior becomes a source of cognitive dissonance that works against them, and through all of this, you appear to have been nothing but supportive. You gave them every chance. You believed in them. It's not your fault they couldn't live up to the reputation you helped build for them. This is the kind of move that Machiavelli would have appreciated for its elegance. You've weaponized praise, turned generosity into a trap, and emerged looking like the better person while they struggle under the weight of expectations they can't meet. But let's address something important here. All of these strategies require a level of emotional control that most people simply don't have. The reason direct confrontation is so common isn't because it's effective, it's because it provides immediate emotional relief. When someone wrongs us, we feel angry, hurt, and betrayed. Confronting them lets us express those feelings and discharge that emotional energy. The Machiavellian approach requires you to suppress, or at least defer that immediate emotional satisfaction in service of a more strategic goal. This is difficult. It requires you to smile at someone you'd rather scream at. It requires you to be patient when every instinct is screaming for immediate action. It requires you to think several moves ahead while your emotions are demanding immediate resolution. This is why these strategies, while more effective, are less commonly employed. Most people simply can't maintain the necessary emotional discipline. They confront, they explode, they make their feelings known, and in doing so, they sacrifice strategic advantage for emotional catharsis. If you want to master the art of punishment without confrontation, you first need to master yourself. You need to be able to maintain composure when you feel anything but composed. You need to be able to think long-term when your emotions are pulling you toward short-term satisfaction. This doesn't mean suppressing your emotions entirely. It means channeling them productively. Your anger can fuel your determination to succeed. Your hurt can sharpen your awareness of power dynamics. Your desire for justice can motivate careful planning. But these emotions must serve your strategy, not dictate it. There's another crucial element: timing. The person who punishes without confrontation understands that immediate response is often the wrong response. Sometimes the most effective punishment is delivered weeks or even months after the initial wrong. By then, your target has relaxed their guard. They think they got away with it. They've forgotten to be careful around you, and that's when the consequences they set in motion finally catch up with them, seemingly out of nowhere. This delayed punishment has another advantage. It's much harder to connect to the initial wrong. When someone betrays you and you immediately retaliate, the cause and effect are obvious to everyone. But when consequences arrive long after the initial action, they seem less like revenge and more like karma, like the natural working out of universal justice. Machiavelli would tell you that the appearance of inevitability is more powerful than the appearance of personal agency. When your enemies fall, it should seem as though they simply failed, as though circumstances turned against them, as though fate or their own choices led to their downfall. Your hand in the matter should be invisible, or at least deniable. Now let's talk about something that makes many people uncomfortable: the ethics of all this. Is it moral to punish people without giving them a chance to defend themselves through direct confrontation? Isn't there something cowardly about indirect methods? Here's the thing about ethics and power: they don't operate in separate realms. The question isn't whether to engage with power dynamics, they exist, whether you engage with them or not. The question is whether you'll understand how they work and make conscious choices about how to navigate them, or whether you'll pretend they don't exist and become their victim. Consider this. Is it more ethical to confront someone directly, creating a spectacle that damages both your reputations and poisons the entire social or professional environment? Or to address the problem quietly in a way that minimizes collateral damage? Is it more ethical to give someone advance warning that you're going to make them face consequences, allowing them time to create defenses and counter-narratives? Or to ensure that justice is actually achieved even if it's achieved through indirect means? The ethics here are murkier than simple rules would suggest. Sometimes the most ethical path is the one that achieves the right outcome with minimal damage to innocent bystanders. Sometimes protecting yourself and others from a toxic person requires methods that don't announce themselves. But there are lines, and this is important. The Machiavellian approach to punishment without confrontation should be reserved for situations where direct approaches would be genuinely counterproductive, or where you're dealing with someone who has already demonstrated they won't respond reasonably to direct communication. This isn't a toolkit for casual use against anyone who mildly annoys you. There's a difference between strategic indirection and sadistic manipulation. The goal should be to address genuine wrongs or protect yourself from harmful people, not to exercise power for its own sake or to hurt people out of petty spite. Machiavelli was writing advice for leaders trying to maintain stability and protect their states, not a manual for workplace bullying or social cruelty. The test is this: are you acting to achieve a legitimate goal that serves more than just your ego, or are you acting purely to make someone suffer? If it's the latter, you're not being Machiavellian, you're just being cruel. And cruelty for its own sake is ultimately self-destructive because it makes enemies without purpose and creates chaos without benefit. Let's discuss one more crucial strategy: the power of being underestimated. When you punish without confrontation, you're often most effective when your target doesn't see you as a threat. This means sometimes cultivating an image of being less capable, less aware, or less interested in power dynamics than you actually are. People who are underestimated have enormous latitude to act because no one's watching them carefully. Their moves aren't scrutinized because no one thinks they're capable of making strategic moves. This allows you to position pieces on the board while others aren't paying attention. Machiavelli understood that the appearance of weakness can be a form of strength. When people think you're not a threat, they let their guard down around you. They say things they shouldn't. They make moves they'd be more careful about if they respected your capabilities. And all of this gives you information and opportunities that you wouldn't have if you projected strength from the beginning. This is particularly effective when combined with what we might call the strategy of patient escalation. Someone wrongs you, and your initial response is so mild that they think they can continue or escalate their behavior. They become bolder, more careless, and all the while, you're documenting, building alliances, and preparing the ground. By the time they realize they should have been more careful around you, it's far too late. The final element I want to discuss is the importance of maintaining your own integrity through all of this. The greatest risk in studying and employing Machiavellian strategies isn't that you'll be caught, it's that you'll lose yourself in the process. It's surprisingly easy to become the kind of person you initially wanted to protect yourself against. This is why these strategies should be employed sparingly, consciously, and with clear ethical boundaries. You're not trying to become a manipulator by nature. You're trying to understand manipulation so you can defend against it and, when necessary, respond to it effectively. The person who truly masters these arts is not someone who employs them constantly, but someone who has the option to employ them when necessary, while generally preferring more direct and honest approaches. They're tools in your toolkit, not your default mode of operation. Think of it like this: knowing how to fight doesn't mean you should spend your life fighting. But knowing you can fight, knowing you have options when threatened, fundamentally changes how you move through the world. You're calmer, more confident, and less likely to be taken advantage of precisely because you're not helpless if someone decides to test you. The same applies to these strategies of punishment without confrontation. Simply knowing they exist, understanding how they work, and being capable of employing them when necessary, this knowledge changes your relationship to power dynamics. You're less likely to be victimized because predators sense, even if unconsciously, that you're not an easy target. There's a broader lesson here about power and visibility. We live in a culture that celebrates overt displays of power and that valorizes confrontation and direct action. We admire people who speak truth to power, who stand up for themselves, and who engage in dramatic confrontations, and sometimes those are exactly the right moves. But Machiavelli would remind us that the most enduring power often operates beneath the surface, that influence is most effective when it's least visible, and that sometimes the person who seems to be doing nothing is actually doing everything that matters. The winds blow, and those who stand rigid against them are broken, but those who bend, who flow, who redirect force rather than opposing it directly, they endure. They shape outcomes without seeming to shape them. They punish without confronting. They win without appearing to compete. This is perhaps the deepest wisdom in the Machiavellian approach. Power is most effective when it's least obvious. The moment you have to announce your power, demonstrate your power, or prove your power through direct confrontation, you've already lost something crucial. True power doesn't need to announce itself. It simply acts, and the world shapes itself around those actions. So when someone wrongs you, when confrontation seems tempting, pause. Ask yourself, will direct confrontation actually achieve what I want, or will it simply make me feel better momentarily while creating new problems? Is there a way to address this that doesn't require me to make myself the obvious agent of consequences? Can I create conditions where the right outcome unfolds naturally, without requiring me to be the villain in anyone's story? These are the questions that separate the impulsive from the strategic, the reactive from the truly powerful. Because at the end of the day, the art of punishing without confrontation isn't about being manipulative or cruel. It's about understanding that power flows through invisible channels, that influence operates beneath the surface, and that sometimes the most effective action is the action that nobody notices until it's too late to stop. Life keeps knocking us down, as the Buddha observed, but perhaps some of those knockdowns are more intentional than they appear. Perhaps someone somewhere has read their Machiavelli and understood that punishment delivered without confrontation is punishment that can't be defended against, can't be traced back, can't be fought. And now you understand it too. The question is what you'll do with that understanding.